Chapter 11, A Critique of the Theory of Multiple Intelligences. In Part 2, I have put forth a novel theory of intelligences, one designed to provide a positive model of the different intellectual strengths displayed by human beings. For the most part, I have proceeded by demonstration. That is, I have introduced each of the intelligences through examples, and have sought to indicate their utility by reviewing the various ways in which these intelligences have been deployed in diverse cultural settings. Many details concerning these intelligences and their manner of operation remain to be filled in. Moreover, most of the limitations of the theory have been glossed over or ignored altogether. In this chapter, I begin the task of examining this new theory with a more critical eye. It is important to consider how the theory stacks up with other competing theories of human cognition. Is it too extreme or too eclectic? What does it accomplish and what does it omit? How could the theory be expanded to incorporate other facets of our knowledge of human beings? And how could it be made more useful to practitioners and policymakers? This cluster of questions will concern us for the remainder of the book, as I attempt to place the theory of multiple intelligences in a wider context. My concern in this and the next chapter is primarily critical, though in Chapter 12 I begin to build a bridge connecting the main lines of this theory to those aspects of education and practice that occupy central stage in the final chapters of the book. For those individuals who are interested chiefly in the application of the theory, it is possible to proceed directly to Chapter 13. In its strong form, multiple intelligence theory posits a small set of human intellectual potentials, perhaps as few as 7 in number, of which all individuals are capable by virtue of their membership in the human species. Owing to heredity, early training, or, in all probability, a constant interaction between these factors, some individuals will develop certain intelligences far more than others. But every normal individual should develop each intelligence to some extent, given but a modest opportunity to do so. In the normal course of events, the intelligences actually interact with and build upon one another from the beginning of life. Moreover, as I shall demonstrate in some detail in Chapter 12, they are eventually mobilized in the service of diverse social roles and functions. Nonetheless, I believe that at the core of each intelligence, there exists a computational capacity or information processing device that is unique to that particular intelligence, and upon which are based the more complex realizations and embodiments of that intelligence. Throughout, I have tried to suggest what these core components might be: phonological and grammatical processing in the case of language, tonal and rhythmic processing in the case of music. For present purposes, however, the idea that each intelligence has one or more raw computational cores is more important than the precise delineation of these cores. I would not wish any reader to take this metaphor of a computational device or computer more seriously than it is intended. Certainly, I have no reason to believe that the neural mechanisms in the brain work identically to the electromechanical components of a computer. Nor do I have any wish to suggest that my computational devices are engaged in complex decisional processes about whether a certain signal is or is not musical or grammatical or personal. Rather, what I want to convey is that the normal human being is so constituted as to be sensitive to certain informational content. When a particular form of information is presented, various mechanisms in the nervous system are triggered to carry out specific operations upon it. And from the repeated use of, elaboration of, and interaction among these various computational devices, eventually flow forms of knowledge that we would readily term intelligent. It may seem odd that so venerated a concept as intelligence be thought of as composed of dumb mechanisms, that is, ones insensitive to larger meanings, ones that simply operate in quasi-reflexive fashion when stimulated by certain contents or inputs. The philosopher Robert Nozick offers a helpful discussion of this point. It is no illuminating explanation of our possession of a trait to attribute it to a little person within us, a psychological homunculus who exercises that very same trait. If there is to be an explanation of how our intelligence functions, it will have to be in terms of factors that, taken individually themselves, are dumb. For example, in terms of a concatenation of simple operations that can be done by a machine. A psychological explanation of creativity will be in terms of parts or processes which aren't themselves creative. The explanation of any valuable trait, feature, or function of the self will be in terms of some other trait, one which does not have precisely that value and probably is not valued. So it is not surprising that the explanations are reductionistic, presenting a picture of us as less valuable. Nonetheless, it is a burden of the following chapters to indicate the ways in which, building upon dumb computational capacities, we may still end up with intelligent and even highly creative behavior. It is best, then, to think of the various intellectual competences introduced here as a set of natural kinds of building blocks, out of which productive lines of thought and action are built. Not to push the analogy too far, we might think of the intelligences as elements in a chemical system, basic constituents that can enter into compounds of various sorts and into equations that yield a plethora of processes and products. These intelligences, while initially raw and unmediated, have the potential to be involved in symbol systems, to be enculturated through their implementation in cultural tasks. Here they differ decisively from their counterparts in other animals. We can see them operating in isolated fashion in certain unusual populations and atypical situations, and it is the opportunity to examine these special circumstances systematically that has permitted us to identify the core operations in each domain. But in normal human intercourse, one typically encounters complexes of intelligences functioning together smoothly, even seamlessly, in order to execute intricate human activities. As I noted in the introductory chapters, the idea of multiple intelligences is an old one. Different facets of the mind were recognized even in Greek times, and faculty psychology reached its heyday in the early 19th century, well before scientific psychology had even gotten underway. It is a further matter of historical record that faculty psychology became almost completely discredited, so much so that it is more likely to appear in a compendium of curiosities than in a textbook of psychological theories. Yet recently this approach has experienced a sort of comeback. A number of theorists have put forth points of view that bear at least a family resemblance to the present formulation. Before considering a few of these rejuvenated faculty theories, it is worth considering the factors that have engendered the renaissance of this modular view of intellectual capacities. In its ardor to follow the physical sciences, psychology has searched for the most general laws and processes, capacities that can cut across any manner of content and that can therefore be considered truly fundamental. The most honored figures of the previous generation of psychologists, Clark Hull, Kenneth Spence, B.F. Skinner, epitomize this trend. Typically, they search for the basic laws of sensation, perception, memory, attention, and learning, which, once discovered, were assumed to work equivalently across language and music, across visual and auditory stimuli, across elementary and complex patterns and problems. In its strong, uniformist version, this search had as its goal a single set of principles, usually laws of association, that were assumed to underlie all of the aforementioned faculties. Under such an analysis, memory was faint perception, learning was enhanced or differentiated perception, and the like. It is generally agreed that this program of psychology, well motivated though it may have been, has not been notably successful. One rarely hears nowadays of the search for basic, all-encompassing psychological laws. Traces of this approach nonetheless are discernible in certain dominant schools of cognitive psychology, those that rely heavily on the model of a general-purpose serial computer. Here one encounters faith in a set of related concepts, general problem-solving skills which can be mobilized for any problem that can be clearly stated, frame, script, or schema analysis, a way of making sense of seemingly diverse elements by viewing them within a structured context, such as the script for a familiar set of events, an overall planning or TOTE unit, which uses feedback to determine whether an intended task has in fact been carried out, a limited short-term memory capacity, which can be used up by any content, a central processor, which initially receives all input, and an executive, which determines how the organism should deploy its various capacities in pursuit of a goal. These approaches have, to my mind, been more successful than those of the earlier generation of learning theorists. But they have also proved inadequate and oftentimes wrong-headed in their analysis of key psychological processes. Sharing some of these misgivings, A number of theorists have recently put forth points of view that question the centrality, or at any rate the hegemony, of a model that posits general all-purpose mechanisms of mind. The British experimental psychologist D. Alan Allport has proposed that the human mind, following the human brain, is best thought of as a large number of independent production systems. These computational units operate in parallel rather than serially, and are each specifically keyed to and activated by a certain kind of information. As he puts it, overwhelming evidence has accumulated for the existence of specialized neurons, responding selectively to particular, often quite abstract, invariant properties of the sensory input, as a major design feature of the central nervous system. Key to Allport's formulation is the claim that every production system is content-dependent. Our cognitive activities are related not to the quantity of information to be processed, but rather to the presence of particular patterns to which specific neural structures must and do resonate. Allport rejects the need for a central processor in charge of these units. As he sees it, these production systems simply work in parallel, with the ones that fire the most carrying the day. He notes, metaphorically, that control simply passes among systems as the result of something like a discussion among experts, that is, among the various highly sensitized production systems. He finds no need for not even a rational account of a central homunculus that would decide what to do. As he asks, what would the central processor do? For the most part, Allport's specialized production systems and their associated neurons deal with much finer units of information than do the particular intelligences I posit. Yet, in sympathy with my account, Allport indicates that the modular principle of functionally separable subsystems appears to hold also at a molar level of analysis, one that maps onto such behaviorally relevant systems as language or visual perception. In fact, Allport cites evidence of the breakdown of mental abilities following brain damage as the firmest foundation for the existence of intellectual modules along the lines that I have sketched. Thus, although the theory was put forth for quite separate reasons, the Allport model agrees in major particulars with my own point of view. In a more extensive discussion, Jerry Fodor, philosopher and psychologist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has eloquently defended the modularity of mind. Drawing most heavily on recent empirical studies of linguistic competence and of visual processing, some of them inspired by his colleague Noam Chomsky, Fodor argues that mental processes are best thought of as independent or encapsulated modules, with each operating according to its own rules and exhibiting its own processes. Siding clearly with the faculty psychology views of Franz Joseph Gall, see Chapter 2, and against more recent generations of theorists, Fodor rejects horizontal processes like general perception, memory, and judgment in favor of vertical modules like language, visual analysis, or musical processing, each with its characteristic mode of operation. Fodor is not particularly concerned with the precise identity of each module. That is an empirical question. But he puts forth his own hunch that the modules will tend to reflect the different sensory systems, with language constituting a separate module of its own. Thus far, I sense no fundamental disagreement with Fodor, who in fact posits modules at a level of analysis close to that with which we have been dealing here. But Fodor contends further that only certain portions of cognition can be explained through these relatively encapsulated modules. He sees the need for positing a central, unencapsulated region of mind, one concerned with the fixing of beliefs. The central processor has access to the information from the different modules, can compare the various inputs with one another, and can draw on this wealth of data flexibly in order to make decisions and solve problems and do many other things that humans are skilled at doing. The comparisons affected by the central processor allow individuals to make the best hypotheses of what the world is like. In adopting this point of view, Fodor deviates from a pure modular perspective. Indeed, he indicates that even as the modular point of view accords with the localized view of the nervous system, the central processing perspective reflects a more equipotential view of the brain, with diverse areas of the nervous system participating in a wide range of activities and being, at least potentially, in constant communication with one another. Yet Fodor ultimately reaches a conclusion that, though pessimistic from a scientific point of view, aligns his position somewhat closer to my own. Fodor concludes that scientific investigation should be able to illuminate the modules because they are relatively distinct and so can be subject to controlled experiment, but that the central processor is most probably immune to such study because its lines of information are at once unlimited and totally interconnected. As a practical matter, then, the science of cognition reduces to the study of the individual modules. Even if the central processing view is valid, says Fodor, we will not be able to incorporate it meaningfully into our science of cognition. Whether there is the need to posit some central processing mechanism is a complex question that, all agree, cannot yet be adequately resolved. Some authorities sympathetic to a modular point of view like Xenon Pilation feel that it is important to make a principled distinction between impenetrable processes, which are impervious to information from other systems, and penetrable processes, which can be influenced by goals, beliefs, inferences, and other forms of knowledge and information. Other researchers, such as Geoffrey Hinton and James Anderson, who have been influenced by a parallel model of the operations of the nervous system, see neither the reason nor the use for a hypothetical central processor. Still, other researchers equivocate. Michael Gazzaniga and his colleagues maintain that there are multiple mental systems in the brain, each with the capacity to produce behavior and each with its own impulses for action, that are not necessarily conversant internally, but go on to propose that the natural language system may eventually exert some kind of control over the other modules. In my own view, which I shall discuss in detail, it is preferable as a research ploy to determine the extent to which all human activities can be thought of as involving the development of, and varied interaction among, the several individual intelligences. In the end, it may even turn out that one can explain high-level processes in either way, that is, through intricate combinations of intelligences or through the positing of some kind of supermodular capacity, with its own genesis and history. But even this ecumenical resolution seems premature. That points of view similar to multiple intelligence or MI theory are in the air is a source of some encouragement for my own efforts. There are many competing theories concerning intelligence as well, and some of these will be discussed in Chapter 12, following my review of the present theory. At the same time, it makes it more important to justify some of the particular moves that I have made in putting forth my own theory. It is evident, for example, that the size of the candidate modules can vary widely from extremely delimited production systems, such as those involved in the perception of a phoneme or the detection of a line, to far more general modules, such as those involved in language or spatial perception. My own feeling is that both the mini and the maxi module efforts are equally correct and can be equally justified, but that they serve different purposes. To the extent that one wants to model faithfully what the nervous system is doing, it is appropriate to focus on the smallest possible modules that can be related to specific behavior. Here, the course favored by Allport, or Hinton and Anderson, makes the most sense. On the other hand, if one seeks a framework relevant to educators or policymakers in the field of human development, then it is important to posit modules at the levels of analysis employed in everyday discussion. In this latter instance, the Fodor or Gazzaniga position seems preferable. However, such common sense categories can only be adopted if they actually emerge during the course of investigations as natural kinds, as legitimate groupings of finer-grained modules. Otherwise, arbitrary merging of mini-modules into maxi-modules is simply not justified. Thus, it is of the highest importance that the various mini-modules investigated by researchers like Allport or Hinton, in fact, seem to coalesce in terms of broader domains. In other words, that various specific perceptual capacities do seem to become part of a more wide-ranging spatial system, even as the various specific linguistic analyzers can validly be spoken of as part of a more general linguistic system. It seems plausible that, over the course of millions of years of evolution, such individual production systems have evolved to become part of far wider-ranging and highly intermeshed modules. This happy circumstance can be exploited by those of us interested in positing mental domains that will be useful to practitioners concerned with education. And what of my use of the loaded term intelligence? As hinted at earlier, part of the motivation for using this term is my desire to put forth a more viable model of intelligence. I seek to replace the current, largely discredited notion of intelligence as a single inherited trait or set of traits that can be reliably assessed through an hour-long interview or a paper and pencil test. But it should be said here as well that nothing much hangs on the particular use of this term, and I would be satisfied to substitute such phrases as intellectual competences, thought processes, cognitive capacities, cognitive skills, forms of knowledge, or other cognate mentalistic terminology. What is crucial is not the label, but rather the conception that individuals have a number of domains of potential intellectual competence that they are in the position to develop if they are normal and if the appropriate stimulating factors are available. As normal human beings, we exploit these potentials in dealing with a range of materials and objects, which are given meaning by the situations in which they are employed. In the framework proposed by my colleague Israel Scheffler, intellectual potentials can be realized if preventive circumstances are absent, if the appropriate sequences of experiences are forthcoming, and if there is determination to pursue these lines of growth. I should note that in the preceding chapters, I have tended to use examples of the highest forms of realization of an intellectual potential. Accordingly, I have focused on those who produce in a realm and have dwelled upon high forms of production, such as musical composition or poetic creation. However, the analysis extends readily to perception and appreciation, as well as to production, and to diverse forms of art, science, or sense-making, be they traditional or innovative, folk culture or high culture. Indeed, these intelligences are routinely seen at work in ordinary activities of non-specialized individuals, but their most illustrious realizations will be properly noted in those gifted in artistic or scientific production. There is a final point that should be made before I turn to some of the questions raised by the theory of multiple intelligences. Even if the theory proves well motivated as far as it goes, there are numerous areas of human psychology that it cannot encompass. Included here would be such chapters, or entire textbooks in themselves, that treat social psychology, personality psychology, the psychology of temperament, the psychology of affect or feeling, the development of character. In no sense is the theory of multiple intelligences designed to do away with or supplant these proper subjects of inquiry. Yet, it would be equally misleading to suggest that MI theory proceeds on a plane completely removed from these traditional concerns. In fact, the theory cuts across them in at least two ways. First of all, MI theory seeks to underscore the extent to which ways of knowing, forms of knowledge, are present in virtually every realm of human existence. Thus, far from being divorced from cognition, our capacities to interact with other individuals, to enjoy works of art, or to participate in athletics or dance, each involve highly developed forms of cognition. MI theory seeks to establish the pervasiveness of intellectual activities in areas where it has hitherto often been excluded. MI theory may also contribute by suggesting that certain facets of traditional psychology will be properly subsumed within a particular intelligence. According to my analysis, many aspects of social development and social behavior fall under the purview of interpersonal intelligence, just as various aspects of the development of personality, character, and affect can be treated within the purview of intrapersonal intelligence. Just how the lines among these fields could be redrawn, and which aspects of these traditional fields continue to fall outside MI theory, is a task that can properly be saved for another day. Two other perennial concerns of psychology, motivation and attention, have also escaped treatment in my presentation. I have no doubt that these are extremely pivotal aspects of human existence, and that attempts to train any, indeed, all of the intelligences are likely to come to naught in the absence of proper motivation and sufficiently focused attention. Moreover, my own guess is that mechanisms of motivation and attention will turn out to be rather general. In other words, proper theories of motivation and attention will turn out to have applicability across the several intellectual spheres. Yet it should be evident, even to casual observation, that commitment in one or another intellectual sphere may entail high degrees of motivation or attention, without similar investments being evident in other areas. A youngster may be highly motivated to become a musician and display superb attentional capacities with regard to instrumental practice, while exhibiting neither motivation nor attention in other spheres of life. Thus, even if a general theory of attention or motivation should be forthcoming, it would still have to account for evident differences in the extent to which these vaunted capacities are mobilized in activities representing different intellectual realms. Thus far, in my survey of other areas of psychology, I have been concerned with concepts and lines of explanation that may poach upon the intelligences but are not regularly thought of as cognitive in nature. It has seemed possible to discuss these summarily without placing MI theory in serious jeopardy. But more volatile issues arise when we consider certain other aspects of human behavior, more frankly, cognitive in nature, which also appear at first blush to elude my analytic framework. These are cognitive capacities that seem to be higher level, capacities like common sense, originality, or metaphoric capacity, which clearly make use of mental skills, but because of their seemingly broad and general nature, seem inexplicable within terms of individual intelligences. In truth, it is by no means evident how each of these terms can be explained within multiple intelligence theory, and if they cannot, how the theory must be modified if they are to be adequately accounted for. Yet, in a work on this topic, it seems incumbent upon the author to at least reveal his intuitions with respect to these key intellectual functions. I do so here with the understanding that further analyses might well lead in quite different directions. Perhaps the least problematic general cognitive term is common sense, which I define as the ability to deal with problems in an intuitive, rapid, and perhaps unexpectedly accurate manner. What has struck me in the analysis of the term common sense is that it is customarily invoked with reference to two kinds of individuals: those skillful in the interpersonal domain and those gifted in the mechanical realm, bodily and spatial in my terms. In contrast, the term common sense seems rarely if ever invoked in discussions of individuals skilled in music, math, or purely spatial concerns. One point about common sense, then, is that far from being common coin, it seems to be applied preferentially to individuals with highly developed skills in one or two areas of intelligence, and not in the kind of across-the-board manner implied by the term. Common sense, in other words, seems cognate to the practical application of a small minority of intelligences. Nonetheless, I recognize that the term may apply as well to individuals who seem able to plan ahead, to exploit opportunities, to guide their destinies and those of others in a prudent way, uncontaminated by jargon, ideology, or elaborate but possibly irrelevant theories. Such an ability seems less readily accounted for simply as highly developed mechanical or social abilities. Such an individual would seem to be distinguished by the capacity to bring together a wide amount of information and to make it part of a general and effective plan of action. In order to account for this highly desirable form of competence, it proves necessary to bring to bear a number of other considerations. To begin with, the ability to engage in calculations about the proper ordering and orchestration of multiple lines of activity involves logical mathematical intelligence. Then, if an individual is to engage in considerable planning about his life, or the lives of others, it is necessary to posit a highly developed intrapersonal intelligence, or, more simply, a mature sense of self. Finally, the movement from the ability to plan a line of action to the actual achievement of actions, from dreams to deeds, transports us away from the realm of cognition, in a strict sense, to the arena of practice or effective action. Here we impinge on the sphere of will, certainly a crucial component in the ways in which we actually lead our lives, but one that I have also elected to skirt in this study of human intelligences. A second cognitive capacity that may elude our theory of intelligences is that of originality or novelty, the skill of fashioning an unfamiliar and yet worthy product within a particular realm, be it an innovative story or dance, the solution of a personal conflict or a mathematical paradox. To my own way of thinking, originality or novelty does in fact occur principally, if not exclusively, within single domains. One rarely, if ever, encounters individuals who are original or novel across the intellectual board, though clearly some individuals have attained skills of a highly creative sort in more than one domain, the Leonardo phenomenon. Thus, the need to explain this capacity may reduce to the need to explain novelty within those particular domains where it is in fact found, and to explain why a few individuals succeed in more than one. As in other facets of this work, I find it useful to take a developmental perspective on the issue of novelty. Early in life, most children give the appearance of engaging in original or novel behavior. I think that they do so because of two related factors. First of all, the young child is not keenly aware of boundaries between domains, and so more readily transgresses them, thereby arriving oftentimes at unusual and appealing juxtapositions and associations. Second, the young child does not have an effective stake in arriving at a single literal interpretation of a situation or a problem. He is not bothered by inconsistencies, departures from convention, or non-literalness. This insouciance, too, contributes to the apparently higher incidence of novel products, though it by no means ensures that these products will be cherished or even properly interpreted by others. Early originality and novelty, however compelling they may be to the analyst or the parent, are distant from those original and novel creations that we can await, though not necessarily expect, from highly skilled practitioners in a field. It is worth noting that such originality and novelty, while often accepted as an unalloyed good in contemporary Western society, is in fact deemed undesirable in many cultures, in which adherence to an earlier consolidated tradition is the unquestioned goal. However, according to my own analysis, genuinely original or novel activities can come about only when an individual has achieved mastery in the field where he has been working. Only such an individual possesses the necessary skills and sufficient understanding of the structure of the field to be able to sense where a genuine innovation will lie and how best to achieve it. But we do not actually know at which point in development such originality or novelty can come about, and whether it is, in fact, an option for every individual who has worked his way through an intellectual domain to its highest levels. If he has done so, it is up to the skilled practitioner himself whether he in fact produces original work or is simply satisfied with realizing a prior tradition. Perhaps, however, the seeds for originality date back far earlier and reflect basic temperament, personality, or cognitive style. On this analysis, individuals would be marked early on as potential creators of original works. These specially earmarked individuals would then become likely candidates for original productions even if they have not reached the top of their field. In contrast, others who lack these personal attributes will never be original, even if they attain superlative technical skills. Modest empirical support for the latter position comes from an informal study that some colleagues and I conducted a few years ago. We interviewed several individuals who had become highly original musical composers. In each case, we found that at as early as 10 or 11 years of age, these future composers were not satisfied simply to perform the pieces of music presented to them, but had already begun to experiment in various ways, searching for variations that were more appealing. In other words, as we saw in the case of Igor Stravinsky at an even younger age, certain gifted young musicians were already composing and decomposing. So far as I have been able to determine, this experimentation at an early age is not common among those individuals who become superlative performers but do not regularly compose. Individuals do not begin as Menuhins and end up as Mozarts. Further support for this point of view comes from numerous studies of the creative personality. These studies document that certain personality traits, such as ego strength and willingness to defy tradition, characterize the outstanding creative individuals within a particular domain. They also help to explain the lack of a relationship between scores on creativity measures and scores on more conventional tests of intellectual strengths, at least above a certain level of IQ. Capacities that prove more challenging to account for in terms of MI theory include the abilities to make metaphors, to perceive analogies, and to cut across various intellectual domains in the process of forging such illuminating connections. In fact, this family of capacities seems at odds with the whole notion of separate intelligences. For the metaphoric intelligence, if we may so tentatively label this set of capacities, is defined by the very capacity to integrate diverse intelligences. It is this sort of realization that apparently encouraged Jerry Fodor to posit a central processor that could integrate the inputs from separate modules. Nor is a proponent of MI theory made more confident in his claims by the knowledge that Aristotle singled out the capacity to create metaphors as the very mark for genius. It would be an inadequate cognitive theory indeed that would allow genius to slip through its analytic fingers. But MI theory does offer some ways of approaching the issue of metaphoric ability. To begin with, it may be the particular hallmark of logical mathematical intelligence to perceive patterns wherever they may be. Thus, an individual with strong logical mathematical abilities may be in a favorable position to discern metaphors, though not necessarily to judge their worth. Some modest support for this speculation comes from the fact that scores on the widely used Miller analogies test on AMIT correlate highly with other measures of logical power. It is also possible, in fact, highly likely, that the capacity to discern metaphors and analogies exists within particular domains. As I noted earlier, the capacity to contrive spatial images or metaphors has been of great usefulness to scientists who are trying to discover new relationships or to convey to a wider audience those relationships that they have uncovered. Moreover, it is quite possible that practitioners become skilled at discovering relationships within their chosen domains. Thus, within the language domain, the poet will discern many analogies and metaphors across semantic categories, even as the painter, the architect, or the engineer may discover numerous metaphors and analogies within the particular symbol systems, favored in their respective domains. Thus, at least within particular domains, individuals with well-honed skills may well be the prime candidates to become effective metaphorizers. But this line of explanation still circumvents that genius figure, the individual whose abilities extend across various domains and who, indeed, is marked by the capacity to find connections between language and music, dance and social communion, the spatial and the personal realms. One could argue that these individuals have a highly developed metaphoric capacity in one domain, say logical, mathematical, or spatial, that they are simply importing to other domains. But I myself do not find this explanation fully convincing. While it seems to me that any domain might serve as the principal vehicle, in a technical sense, for the forging of metaphors, it is unlikely to constitute the entire explanation for a highly skilled metaphoric ability. Fortunately, there is evidence on the general development of metaphoric capacities, much of it courtesy of our own laboratory at Harvard Project Zero. We can detect at least 3 forms of analogic or metaphoric capacity in all normal children. To begin with perhaps the most remarkable form, young infants seem to be born with the capacity to note similarities across sensory domains, such as parallels in intensity or in rhythms, that are detectable in the auditory and visual realms. Thus, the 6-month-old child can associate an auditory rhythm appropriately with a set of dots or a silent film that exhibits the same rhythm. There is a primitive but nonetheless accurate capacity in the young infant to effect domain connections, a capacity that seems to fall outside the development of specific intelligences, as I have described them in earlier chapters. In the preschool years after the child has become a symbol user, we encounter a second metaphoric capacity. This is the aforementioned time when the child finds it easy, and perhaps appealing, to effect connections among disparate realms, to note similarities among different forms within or across sensory modalities, and to capture these in words or other symbols, to make unusual combinations of words or colors or dance movements, and to gain pleasure in doing so. Thus, the 3 or 4-year-old can note and describe the resemblances between a glass of ginger ale and a foot that has fallen asleep, or between a passage played on the piano and a set of colors, or between a dance and the movement of an airplane. As just suggested in the discussion of novelty, this metaphorizing proclivity gives rise to an early form of originality, one that may not be entirely conscious on the child's part, but that, as my colleagues have shown, is by no means totally accidental either. The early school years are a period where overt metaphorizing is less likely. At this time, the child is striving to understand the structure of each domain and to master domain-relevant skills, and so any excursion to the realm of metaphorizing or analogizing may be unsettling. But once these domains have solidified satisfactorily, and once the child has achieved the requisite skills within desired domains, the possibility for metaphoric connection once again comes to the fore. Here, however, one begins to encounter wide individual differences, with some individuals rarely engaging in adventurous, or even routine, connections across domains. and with others proving more likely to affect these connections, wherever they might be. My own belief is that these various early forms of metaphorizing represent a universal phenomenon, one that lies somewhat apart from the development of specific intelligences, but that constitutes part of the natural developmental process. Infants are so constituted that they can make certain cross-modal connections, just as they are wired to be able to imitate certain behavior patterns of adults. Preschoolers are similarly designed to note similarities and differences as part of their effort to make sense of the world. These are simply facts of development, and any comprehensive account of human development must allow for them. But whether they are directly involved in later, higher levels of intelligence, and if they are, whether the various child forms are all involved, is far from certain. Thus, the analyst is perhaps excused if he does not posit a possibly short-lived metaphoric intelligence, or a set of intelligences that can be glimpsed during the first years of life. When it comes to mature forms of metaphorizing, however, a crucial question arises. Is there an adult form of metaphoric capacity, apart from the separate intelligences, that some individuals have developed to a high degree so that they can bring it to bear upon particular intellectual domains? And if there is, what are the developmental origins of this much prized adult activity? At present, I do not find sufficient evidence to decree a separate form of intelligence. Except for the indisputable existence of a developed end state, metaphoric intelligence fails to exhibit those signs that have proved central in the identification of other intelligences. My own fallback position is that individuals who are skilled metaphorizers have developed this ability in one or more domains as part of their general learning process, but now feel sufficiently secure with this skill that they can apply it in the domains in which they happen to be involved. At his best, the superb metaphorizer will discern connections virtually everywhere and can censor those that appear unproductive or uncommunicative. Still, there will be a preferred locus for his metaphorizing capacities, namely those fields in which he is most deeply knowledgeable and in which his metaphorizing ability has found its most fertile grounds. Thus, a skilled metaphorizer, like the scientific essayist Lewis Thomas, will be able to discern and exploit resemblances in the areas of music or dance. But his chief mode of operation will still be in logical mathematical areas. Similarly, the redoubtable poet W. H. Auden, another insightful and inveterate metaphorizer, will comb the world through his poems, but his principal metaphoric point of departure will remain the linguistic realm. Metaphor may spread to many localities, in other words, but it retains a favored home intelligence all the same. A yet more general form of intelligence, somewhat akin to but broader than metaphorizing, has been variously called general synthesizing power, or even wisdom. This intelligence is what one comes to expect from an older individual who has had a wide range of critical experiences in his earlier life and can now apply them appropriately and judiciously in the proper circumstances. On the surface, no capacity would seem further removed from the deployment of a single intelligence, or even of a pair of intelligences. Wisdom or synthesis offers by its very nature the widest view. To the extent that it is parochial or domain-specific, it seems inappropriate to call it wisdom. My own hunch is that these terms are applied to individuals who have some combination of the abilities I have just reviewed. Considerable common sense and originality in one or more domains, coupled with a seasoned metaphorizing or analogizing capacity. The individual can draw upon these abilities, at least in given circumstances, in order to make sage comments and to propose well-motivated lines of action. If this hunch is correct, then any explanation that can account for common sense, originality, and metaphorizing capacity ought to suggest the constituents of ultimate wisdom. Unfortunately, it will take a very wise person indeed to come up with a convincing formulation. The preceding discussion indicates that, at least for some higher-level operations, it should be possible to offer an explanation in terms of the theory of multiple intelligences. These operations sometimes reduce to capacities in but a single domain. For example, interpersonal common sense or originality in sculpture. Sometimes can be seen as the combination of an individual personality trait and an impressive ability in a given intellectual domain, as in the case of an original novelist. sometimes are better viewed as an emergent capacity that begins in one domain but spreads outward, as in certain metaphorizing abilities, and sometimes are best seen as an amalgam of different intellectual strengths, as in the case of wisdom. All of these moves are frankly reductive. They are understandable and perhaps permissible if one wants to salvage MI theory, but are certainly not necessary and perhaps unwise. The fact that the theory of multiple intelligences cannot explain everything does not invalidate the whole theory. At some point in the future course of this theory, it may make sense to add more general abilities or capacities, as Fodor has done, and to use them to garnish the competences that arise from individual capacities. It is appropriate to insert a few supplementary remarks at this point about the cognitive capacity that has already placed the greatest strain on the theory of multiple intelligences. I refer here to the sense of self, that prime candidate for status as a second-order ability that presides over the separate intelligences. In the previous chapter, I viewed the development of self in terms of the personal intelligences. According to my analysis there, the roots of a sense of self lie in the individual's exploration of his own feelings and in his emerging ability to view his own feelings and experiences in terms of the interpretive schemes and symbol systems provided by the culture. Some cultures will tend to minimize a focus on the self, and accordingly, the individual encased in such a culture will not allocate much active agency to his own efforts, and will place a correlative emphasis on the behavior and the needs of others. But in other cultures, such as our own, there is a far greater emphasis on the self as an active decision-making agent possessing considerable autonomy, including the capacity to make pivotal decisions about one's own future existence. Every culture must, of course, strike a balance between the interpersonal and the intrapersonal aspects of knowledge. It is in this modulation that an ultimate sense of self consists. But those societies that are biased toward the intrapersonal, and hence toward an assertive sense of self, pose the gravest threat to any view of the intelligences as a simple conversation among equal elements. As already mentioned in the preceding chapters, one may adopt a number of different strategic approaches to this problem. The first is simply to declare the development of the sense of self as a separate domain of intelligence, one growing out of that core ability to perceive oneself that we encountered in discussing the personal intelligences, but one that becomes fully on a par with the other intelligences that have been treated here. On this analysis, the sense of self would either become a new, eighth intelligence, or would become the mature form of intrapersonal intelligence. The second, more radical move is to declare the intelligence of the self as a separate domain, one inherently privileged from the start, since it serves as a kind of central processor or reflector upon the other capacities. This is the kind of move made by many developmental psychologists who have studied the growth of self. A third move, one that I currently favor, is to view the individual's sense of self as an emergent capacity. It is a capacity that grows initially out of the intrapersonal and the interpersonal intelligences, but that has the option, in certain social settings, of exploiting the other intelligences as a means to a novel end. That novel end is the devising of a special kind of explanatory model encompassing everything that the individual is and everything that the individual does. Let me try to explain in somewhat greater detail what I have in mind. Because human beings have at their disposal a range of symbol systems, such as language, gesturing, mathematics, and the like, they are able to take the inchoate understanding that lies at the core of intrapersonal intelligence and make it public and accessible to themselves, and, for that matter, to interested others. These representational systems enable the individual ultimately to create what is essentially an invented figure of speech, a fictional entity of the mind, a model of what that person is like, what he has done, what his strengths and weaknesses are, how he feels about himself, and the like. The individual can then operate upon this model, even as he can operate upon other models presented in other symbol systems. The fact that this model refers to that entity in life that is most sacred to him confers upon the model a special flavor and feeling. But the intellectual operations the individual brings to bear upon that model are not by their very nature different from those one imposes upon the model of a solar system, a biological organism, or another social creature. It just feels different and more important. And Rather than viewing a sense of self as a domain apart, or as a second-order domain that has some inherent ontological priority over the others, I prefer at this juncture to think of the sense of self as explicable in terms of the existing multiple intelligences. I see this sense of self as the result of the natural evolution of intrapersonal intelligence within an interpreting cultural context, as aided by the representational capacities that emerge in the other forms of intelligence. In the end, the individual can offer an account of himself, one couched in language, or more rarely in other symbol systems, that puts forth in logically acceptable fashion all those properties of himself and all of his own experiences that seem worthy of note. And he can continue to edit this description of himself as events transpire over the years and as his own self-concept alters. The particular account that is offered may or may not be valid, but that is not of the essence here. Crucial, rather, is that through a combination of one's own intellectual competences and through the interpretive schemes furnished by the rest of one's own culture, it is possible to put forth a description of oneself that appears to summarize and regulate the remainder of one's existence. Working together, the intelligences may give birth to an entity that seems larger than them all. Before bringing to a close this critical discussion of MI theory, it seems opportune to indicate the conditions under which the theory could be disproved. After all, if MI theory can explain or explain away all potentially disconfirming evidence, it is not a valid theory in the scientific sense of that term. One might distinguish between two kinds of alterations of the theory. In the happier event, the general line of the theory will continue to be accepted, but minor or major revisions will be made regarding specific claims. For example, it may turn out that certain of the candidate intelligences violate major criteria and so are dropped from consideration. Or alternatively, ones that have been ignored or rejected might themselves earn a position among the select few. In another more substantial revision, it might turn out that the theory of multiple intelligences can account for a significant portion of human intellectual activity, but that it is also advisable to add some other components not presently included. Such would be added if the desirability of some horizontal component, such as perception or memory, was convincingly demonstrated, or if some other capacity, such as metaphor, wisdom, or a sense of self, could be shown to exist apart from the apparatus of multiple intelligence theory. I can readily live with such revision, but it is also possible that the theory will be found deficient in some more fundamental way. If it turns out that the most significant human intellectual activities cannot be explained in terms of MI theory, or can be better explained in terms of some competing theory, then the theory will deservedly be rejected. If it turns out that the kinds of evidence heavily weighted here, for example, neuropsychological and cross-cultural findings, are fundamentally flawed, then the whole line of inquiry forged here will have to be reevaluated. It is also possible that further studies of the nervous system, or of other cultures, will suggest a vastly different picture of human intellective processes, and thus, there would also have to be a radical revamping of the theory. Finally, it might turn out that the whole Western inclination to pick out intelligence, or intelligences as a natural kind, may not be the best or even a proper way to slice up the human psyche or human behavior. And in such a case, the present theory, like all those it purports to replace, will go the way of phlogiston. Being so discarded would give me little pleasure, but I would be far less disappointed than if I had put forth a theory whose very nature made it immune to refutation. Even if my original list of intelligences can be salvaged by moves such as the ones just proposed, it is evident that the intelligences cannot be viewed merely as a group of raw computational capacities. The world is enwrapped in meanings, and intelligences can be implemented only to the extent that they partake of these meanings, that they enable the individual to develop into a functioning, symbol-using member of his community. As the earlier quotation from Robert Nozick reminds us, there may be dumb capacities at the center of intelligence, but it is equally true that these capacities must be made smarter if one is successfully to interact with the surrounding society. It is the burden of the next chapter to begin the task of building from raw intellectual capacities to intelligences that can function in a complex and meaning-laden world. These meanings come to figure early on in the story, for the initial percepts and actions of the infant, and all that follow are suffused with significance. From the very first, pleasures and pains are associated with them, and interpretations are imposed upon them. Even more important, what characterizes human intelligences, as against those of other species, is their potential for being involved in all manner of symbolic activity. The perception of symbols, the creation of symbols, the involvement with meaningful symbolic systems of all sorts. This is another and perhaps the most crucial part of the story of human development in a world of meaning. Finally, with increasing age and experience, each individual comes to learn not only the particular consequences attached to individual acts and symbols, but the most general interpretive schemes of the culture. The way in which the worlds of persons and objects, physical forces, and man-made artifacts are interpreted in the particular culture in which he happens to live. This immersion in the culture's Weltanschauung constitutes a final decisive aspect of the life of the human, defining the arena in which his several mature intelligences will be deployed in combination. Talk of specific analyzers, of computers, of production systems, or even of modules no longer suffices once one encroaches upon this level of analysis. We must begin to think in terms of more encompassing categories: the individual's experiences, his frames of reference, his means of sense-making, his overall worldview. All of these would not be possible without specific intellectual computational capacities, but they would never come into being without human symbolic activity. Thus, the development of human symbol systems and symbolizing capacities becomes the next essential part of the story to be related if we are to construct a bridge from intelligences to educational practice. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find Gardner's book summary and many other fundamental persuasion books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychologic and marketing content. See you in the next one.